Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the fourth weekend of August 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original, taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news for our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll review the week at the Democratic National Convention and look ahead as the presidential race is officially set. We'll hear about the security and protests at the DNC, and we'll look at President Joe Biden and what comes next for him. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Dan McCaleb is here with a recap of the DNC and a look ahead at the presidential race moving forward.
The Democratic National Convention concluded Thursday night with Vice President Kamala Harris formally accepting the Democratic Party's nomination for president. With former President Donald Trump embedded as the Republican presidential nominee, it's now a sprint to the November election. Joining me to discuss the race is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, you covered Harris's convention speech. What are your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, it was a bright moment for Harris's campaign. In my view, there's been a big question mark hanging over her campaign. You know, what kind of presidential candidate will she be? What kind of policies will she have? What kind of tone will she strike? And will it be the same as when she was vice president? Because honestly, she was not a very popular vice president. And so in this speech and in this new campaign, she had an opportunity to rebrand herself. Now, it's pretty hard to rebrand yourself in politics, but she had this kind of a sudden dropout of Biden, and his endorsement of her give her that opportunity, and the entire party machine just kind of remechanized to support her, essentially. And so it gave her this opportunity, especially with the endorsement of former President Barack Obama, who's really still the leader, the emotional leader of the party. It gave her an opportunity to rebrand herself. And I think so far she sort of did that. She came out wearing all black. At times she's had a very authoritative presidential tone, I thought. And so, which was important because much of the meme about Kamala Harris so far is kind of that she's sort of this bumbling fool, honestly, because many of her speeches or remarks with reporters are kind of incoherent. She says a lot of words, but it doesn't make sense. And so she came out strong. I thought her speech was very well done. It was very personal. It wasn't too long. If you remember, Trump's RNC speech was like 90 minutes, which was just felt very long. Harris's was, much shorter. And she did, introduce herself on a personal level, talking about her family, her upbringing, and then, her vision for the country. She was still very light on policy details, Dan, which I think is a strategic decision. We talked about whether Harris can really avoid laying out policy plans or taking hard questions from reporters. And so far, she's still, aiming to do that, it looks like. But I thought she did well. She executed the speech well. She rallied the entire party behind her. And the polling shows she's in a dead heat with Trump now. So now it's just 2 months of them battling it out heading into November.
Let's talk about that a little bit. It does appear to be a very close race, which means the swing states, the states that could go either way, as per usual, are going to be key to who wins this election come November. You mentioned policy issues. She has been criticized for not talking about specific policies, laying out very general, very vague policy issues. Right now, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Harris and Trump are committed to one debate officially, with Trump calling for at least one more. Do you think we're going to get a debate about policy issues? Do you think Harris is going to give more details on her policy proposals in the weeks to come?
Well, I think we're definitely going to have that debate, but whether it's about policy is a good question. I think Harris would love for that debate to be about Trump's felony convictions and how Trump appointed justices to the Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade. I mean, Harris is going to, as much as she can, I think this is the vibe candidacy, Dan. She wants to have a better vibe than Trump and to bring up all of his mistakes and just kind of vibe her way into the White House. I really think that is her plan. She's talked so much about joy being the focus. And of course, I mean, there's nothing less policy centric than an emotion, joy. I mean, but I think it's working for, at least for now. Tim Walz is kind of an interesting character, but he does seem to have the joy. He fits the joy mold that they're trying to create. And so I think she just wants to smile more, laugh more, have a better attitude than Trump, and to make him look kind of grumpy. And then that, combined with the coverage of the media, bring her into the White House and get the suburban women that she needs to put her there. But many of whom, J.D. Vance and Trump have anchored over the years. But I think they'll be forced to talk some about policy. Harris, she just speaks in very vague terms. But I mean, as we all know, you can get away with that sometimes in elections. Last night, at the DNC, she talked about creating jobs and lowering costs, but didn't really explain how she would do that. She talked about, right. I mean, anytime she laid out a specific policy, she chose one that was very safe because she referenced a Senate bill that already had some kind of broad Democrat support. So she voiced her support for the immigration reform bill that failed in the Senate earlier this year. She referenced, a sort of voting rights bill that's been in Congress for a while, and she supports that. But there was no big, bold, new policy vision of unique, original ideas of how I'm going to change the country. It's more just, I think for Harris, she's pitching a vibe shift for the country.
Polling also shows, and this is including the Center Square Voters Voice poll, one of the most expansive polls across the country, but polls from other polling companies and other media outlets, that voters trust Donald Trump way more on the economy, on border security, on foreign affairs. On the other hand, voters trust Kamala Harris much more on abortion rights, education issues, etc. Does that even matter at this point? Is this an election about personality?
Well, I think it does matter. What we're seeing here is that the last, 3 months of this election have been very much about personality and not about policy, because a lot of the policy fronts have quieted down. Inflation has slowed down. These, overseas conflicts, Ukraine and, Hamas and Israel, they're still raging, but in the American mind, the media, they've kind of gotten boring. I mean, not huge updates. They're just still going. And so they've kind of faded from memory. So the economy, it's not doing amazing, but it's not, there's nothing terribly bad. We had the stock market dip. We had, jobs, weren't nearly as many jobs created as we previously believed. So there's things going on there. Americans do still feel higher costs, but the problem is that both Democrats and Republicans made this election about personality long before Harris stepped in. I mean, Democrats have made it all about Trump from the beginning and his personality, and they're taking that to the mat, win or lose. That is their game plan. And then, the way that Republicans got Biden out of the race is they made it all about his age and his mental competence, not his policies at all. And that ended up winning. So Harris steps into this race that has been all about the individual, the personality, their, just how they appear. Like, for Biden, it was he appeared old. He appeared like he was mentally fading. So she comes in and she's like, well, I'm going to appear joyful. I'm going to appear vibrant and normal and kind of a counterbalance to Trump's intensity. And so I think, it is a personality election in a particularly unique way, but a shakeup could affect that. I mean, if there's some big economic dip again, Harris is going to be possibly holding the bag on that. If China invades Taiwan in the next few weeks, I mean, that'll change everything. if something nuclear happens or escalation with Iran and Israel, that could affect things. But if the policy issues remain status quo for the next couple months, it will remain an election about personality, and it's unclear who will win if it remains in that way.
Thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all of the news surrounding the presidential election at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on security and protests at the DNC this past week, Dan McCaleb is back.
Chicago played host to the Democratic National Convention this week. Heading into the event, there were concerns over security issues related to the tens of thousands of people who converged on the city to protest various causes. Joining me to discuss this are Illinois Associate Editor Greg Bishop and investigative reporter Brett Rowland, both of whom were on the ground covering the convention in Chicago. Let's start with the protests. Brett, you provided coverage of the daily protests and the dozens of arrests that took place. What are your thoughts on how the city handled the protests and how the protesters acted overall?
The protests, especially Monday and at the start of the week, were fairly organized and well run, and they banged on some fences and tried to get over, but there wasn't a real problem until Tuesday night, and that's when things turned kind of ugly. Not certainly as bad as 1968, but also not good. A rally outside the Israeli consulate, which happens to be right by the largest commuter train station in the city. There was about 55 to 60 arrests, and there was some pretty vicious behavior by protesters toward police, especially female officers, which got Chicago Police Superintendent Larry Snelling pretty upset. He praised his officers throughout the week for the way they handled the situation, for the professionalism they showed in the job, and for the work that they did. But he was clearly upset with the behavior of the protesters after Tuesday night. There were big gatherings throughout the week. There were some smaller gatherings throughout the week, but mostly it was peaceful except for Tuesday. And that's when we saw what was probably the worst behavior of the event.
I know you weren't at the Tuesday night protests where it got a little violent and all the dozens of arrests were made. Generally, overall, Brett, the police, it wasn't just Chicago police. There were local police from other jurisdictions, even out of state. State police was involved. And of course, Secret Service was involved in the security at the actual Democratic National Convention sites events. Just generally speaking, when you were going out and observing some of the protests, did you feel there was a strong enough police presence? Did you feel safe?
I always felt safe. I was out during the day, and at the gatherings, the protesters were generally focused on protesting and listening to speeches. They certainly wanted to get the attention of the lawmakers and delegates inside the convention. How well they did that, I don't know. They had been demanding all week ceasefire in Gaza and an end to U.S. military aid to Israel. But some of their demands for the convention, such as having a speaker, a Palestinian speaker, were never met. And how effective they'll be, I guess, remains to be seen. But the police were all over the city. We had National Guard, we had Illinois State Police, we had Chicago PD, and also officers from everywhere else. And then inside the convention centers, we had Secret Service. So there was a fair amount of security. And I think that, anytime anybody who was downtown this week saw police officers on every block almost, and certainly all around the convention site. So there was a strong police presence.
Thank you, Brett. Greg, turning to you, one of these main storylines heading into Chicago hosting the DNC was the concern that some untold number of migrants were going to be bussed into the city. Texas Governor Greg Abbott has been busing migrants from the southern border to sanctuary cities across the country. Chicago's received more than 40,000 of them. At the Republican National Convention last month in Milwaukee, Abbott said he would be sending more during the DNC, but that didn't seem to materialize.
Yeah, and obviously, in the last day, there was no real big headlines or any show of non-citizens being transported to Chicago. And that gave the Democrats the opportunity to say that the Biden-Harris administration has stemmed the flow and allowed them to also discuss some of their policy initiatives on dealing with the porous border and those who've come across seeking asylum. And we of course, were at the Illinois Democrats breakfasts every morning with the Illinois delegation. And on Thursday, I had asked, for a response from Illinois Comptroller Susana Mendoza, who was one of the speakers at that delegation breakfast. And she said that, the Biden-Harris administration stemmed the flow. And she seemed to kind of ignore the previous 3 years of having that open border policy, where you saw a dramatic spike in the number of non-citizens coming across the border, not just from South America, but from all over the globe. And we've seen millions. And that's why, the border communities were inundated and their resources strained. So they were transporting them to so-called sanctuary cities. But Mendoza also said that she's not happy about having to spend Illinois tax dollars on this issue because it's cost taxpayers over $1 billion in Illinois and expected to cost hundreds of millions, if not more than $1 billion more moving forward, covering things from healthcare subsidies to housing, education, and even legal services. Now, Mendoza did not advocate for amnesty, but she said that the Democrat platform should focus on getting work permits for these individuals so that they can truly contribute to the economy and to the tax base. But that really does ignore some of the concerns that are already on the ground with a lot of minority communities upset, feeling that they're getting passed over with resources going to the non-citizen migrants for those who are already here, having crossed the border seeking asylum. So clearly, while the Democrats may say that there's a victory on this issue here at the end of the Democratic National Convention, that does not allay the concerns of those who have been here all their life, who have felt that they're getting passed over with the resources that they need for their communities. So clearly, this is going to be an ongoing issue, despite the Biden-Harris administration saying that they've solved this issue, but they want more. They want to change the immigration policies. This issue is not going away, despite the headlines not materializing of more migrants showing up during the DNC.
Thank you, Dan, Greg, and Brett. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back again with more on President Joe Biden. It's Dan McCaleb.
President Joe Biden was largely absent from the Democratic National Convention that just concluded in Chicago. He was the keynote speaker Monday night, but he didn't take the stage until after 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time and immediately left for a California vacation, not sticking around for the remaining 3 days of festivities. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, Biden remains president for 4+ months. But it seems at times like he's almost an afterthought. What's your take on President Biden's remaining time in office?
Well, I'm not convinced he's going to get those 4 months personally. I think there's a strong incentive within the Democratic Party to promote Harris and have her finish this race from the White House as an incumbent. But, it will be hard to push Biden out of his spot or have him step down. He could be, the man who got the first woman president in office. I think if he's thinking about his legacy. This week at the Democrat National Convention was very interesting. Biden received, broad applause. Harris has gone out of her way to thank him gratuitously in front of everyone for his work. But it's just, there's still kind of an awkwardness in the room, and everyone knows what happened is that, just a few weeks ago, that Biden was adamant and defiant that he would not step out of this race, getting angry when reporters asked him about it. And now he's all smiles, handing it off to Harris. And so I think that the party is trying to reward him for putting Harris up because Harris is polling much better than he was against Trump. I mean, Biden was, on all accounts, losing this race to Trump. And now Harris has brought it to essentially a tie. She's beating him nationally, but Trump is still winning in the swing states, and we could talk about that if you want. But I think, when a famous Democratic leader once said that about post-birth abortion, that they just try to keep the baby comfortable until they decide what to do with it. And I think that's what the Democratic Party is doing here with Biden. They're just trying to keep him comfortable until they decide what to do with him. He's essentially been neutered in office, and it seems like he's not really in control. When it feels like the Obamas and Pelosi and others behind the scenes are really running things, and Biden is sort of a manager. And reports inside the White House indicate that Biden doesn't really have the capacity to do much managing or work long hours. And so he's basically a figurehead at this point, and all attention is on Harris and Trump. And I think they just want Biden to not make any big mistakes, to not make any gaffes, and let Harris have the spotlight.
That's a bit concerning to me, Casey. There is all kinds of things going on in the world. You've got the Israel-Gaza war. You've got the Russian-Ukraine war. The economy is still sort of teetering. You don't know which way it's going to go after, 40-year high inflation earlier in President Biden's term. The U.S. and the world needs an American leader who's strong and can make decisive decisions. But if everything you say is the case, and man, your thought up front that Biden could actually maybe step down in this current term so Kamala Harris could be elevated to the presidency and be the incumbent in November, that would be huge news. And I don't know, would the voting public buy it, that it's all legitimate, or if it's just a puppeteer who's pulling the strings for the Democrats?
Well, puppeteer is an interesting word, but those who are sort of making a lot of these decisions behind the scenes, I do think they can get away with a lot. I'm not sure they have a very high view of the American public's ability to see what's really going on. So I think they're willing and bold enough to try anything if they think it'll fit their needs. As far as, Biden being in such rough shape and running the country as we have 2 wars and economic distress and everything, the thing that might cheer you up, Dan, is he's actually been in this condition for a long time, and we've made it this far. So what's a few more months, I guess, is you could be optimistic in that way. I mean, despite what Democrats have said, Democrats have acted as if Biden has been totally fine this entire time. And then just in the last couple of months, he's needed to step down. But everyone's known that this has really been going on for years and gotten worse and worse. And finally, Biden couldn't hide it anymore. There are people in the White House, and you see reporting about this, who are making the decisions for Biden. It is definitely scary, though. And I think what's scary about it, beyond the question of competency and security, is a question of democracy, in that, voters elected Biden, but it's clear that Biden hasn't been making many of the decisions. There's some unnamed staffers who are running the country, some cabinet heads too, I suppose. And now Biden won the Democratic primary, but all those votes are basically thrown out in favor of Harris. And so you have a Democratic nominee who didn't receive any votes. And so that's just kind of an interesting, and all this talk about democracy, and I think there's good reason to talk about it. We've seen, now this is the second time, because remember, Democrats, they basically threw Bernie Sanders under the bus a couple of times to get their candidate. And now they've totally just handpicked a candidate. Basically, Obama and Nancy Pelosi picked a candidate. And so the Democratic primary process, to me, seems not very democratic anymore.
Casey, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all the news related to President Biden at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That will do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What are Washington state truckers' concerns about California policies impacting their industry? Why did the Supreme Court reject the Department of Justice's appeal concerning Title IX? And why do price controls lead to shortages? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. House Oversight Chair Representative James Comer is urging National Security Council Advisor Jake Sullivan to take more aggressive action to counter the Chinese Communist Party's influence in the United States. Comer argues that despite warnings from U.S. generals and intelligence officials, the Biden administration is not addressing the threat adequately. He highlights China's long-term strategy to undermine the U.S. through intellectual property theft, military technology espionage, and influence in education. Comer's investigation shows federal agencies lack a cohesive strategy to combat CCP infiltration, which he believes is necessary to protect national security. U.S. Customs and Border Protection announced a significant decrease in southwest border encounters, claiming a 34% drop from June to July, with the lowest numbers in nearly 4 years. Customs and Border Protection attributes the decline to recent policies by the Biden-Harris administration. However, despite these claims, over 10.5 million illegal border crossers have been apprehended this fiscal year, including 2 million gotaways. Critics, including U.S. House Homeland Security Chair Representative Mark Green, argue the administration is downplaying the border crisis, accusing them of creating a shell game that masks the true impact of their policies on U.S. communities. Green cited record high encounters and parole programs as evidence of the growing strain on the system. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs announced it will allocate $806.4 million in grants to reduce homelessness among veterans. Of this, $797.5 million will go toward the Supportive Services for Veterans Families program, which helps veterans find and maintain housing, while $8.9 million will support transitional housing and case management through the grant and per diem program. VA Secretary Dennis McDonough highlighted progress in reducing veteran homelessness. The VA aims to place 46,500 homeless veterans in permanent housing in fiscal year 2024. The California Senate Appropriations Committee has advanced AB 1840, a bill that would allow undocumented immigrants to access the state's zero-down, no-payment home loan program. Authored by Assemblymember Joaquin Arambula, the bill aims to provide undocumented individuals with the same home ownership opportunities as others. While proponents argue it could help families secure financial stability, the committee's analysis warns of significant cost pressures in the millions annually. Critics also point to the risk of inflated housing prices, reminiscent of the policies leading to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. The bill now awaits a Senate floor vote. The North Carolina State Board of Elections has certified the Justice for All party for the November ballot, complying with a federal court ruling after previous denials. The board's decision, made 17 days before absentee ballots are issued, will allow Dr. Cornel West, the party's presidential candidate, to appear on the ballot, along with other potential down-ballot candidates. The federal court ruling in favor of Justice for All followed legal challenges and controversy over the board's initial refusal, which had split along party lines, with the Democrat majority rejecting the request. This decision means all three parties seeking ballot access will be included in the upcoming election. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country on thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on truckers' concerns over California's emission policies, it's our Cole Lauterbach.
The state of Washington has agreed to adopt many of California's environmental standards. This includes one that will require many of the big rigs in the state to run on electricity instead of diesel fuel. Now, the state's truckers are saying the timeline to electrify is going to cause chaos for the supply chain. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell covered this grim warning. TJ, give us a rundown of what the requirements will be in the coming years.
So essentially what's going to go on is that the state is going to require that truckers' sales of trucks in the state, a certain percentage has to be zero emission, which is basically electric. And that percentage will increase over the years. So and depending on the type of truck, the type of vehicle, the percentage could be starting next year, 7% or as high as 11%. And by 2030, for certain types of trucks, the sales have to be 50%.
So half by that time. And the current percentage is maybe point what?
It's almost, I mean, in some cases, there's some places that are just not selling. They're not selling at all, like not one.
And now the association representing truck companies in Washington didn't exactly mince words in their letter to Governor Inslee.
Yeah, they were talking about how there's a lot of, the biggest problem is you can't force someone to buy a truck. I think that's the key issue, is that you cannot force a trucking company to buy a truck that they don't want to buy. And there's a lot of problems with why the sales are not able to sell the vehicles. And one of them is the lack of infrastructure for charging. The cost of these vehicles, they cost way more than a clean diesel truck. And also they don't get the same distance. The zero emission trucks can only go maybe 150, 200 miles per charge. So if there's not a charging station within that distance, and obviously a trucker's not going to want to say, hey, I'm going to run out of battery juice the moment that I get to the charging station. They're going to want to have some wiggle room so that in case anything happens. And then they also have to be certain that the charging port's functional and that it hasn't had vandalism, copperware theft, and that they're actually going to get the full charge that they need. And they also, some of these trucks don't carry as much in terms of cargo capacity as clean diesel ones.
Well, and also one thing that got me thinking after I'd read your story was the logistical nightmare between not only having to plan to commute between chargers, but also the thought that if you're a truck driver, federal law requires that you have 8 hours of, they call bunk time, per day, because, you know, to fight fatigue, we don't need truckers falling asleep and causing massive pileups on the highway. That just adds yet another really, really complicated part of this equation. And also, what happens when, you know, if they do get to 50%, what happens to over-the-road truckers who are not running, you know, Tacoma to Vancouver? Instead, they're running, say, Port of Seattle to Boise, where you're not going to see, once you're out of the state, even if the state does manage to get this charging infrastructure set up and reliable and not vandalized, what happens to those over-the-road truckers once they get out of the state, where, you know, Montana is not going to build electric infrastructure just because Washington said that those truckers had to?
Yeah, what the Washington Trucking Association is worried about is that these trucking companies based in Washington State will simply move to another state, and they either won't operate in Washington State, or they'll just move to a nearby state that's close enough to where they can operate within Washington State, but they're not subject to its laws. Because the state can't mandate that Idaho sells so many zero emission trucks, and they also can't say, hey, you can't bring your trucks over into Washington State unless they're zero emissions. That's not enforced.
Well, they might. I mean, in that regard, they do have the ability, because you have to, as a commercial truck owner, you do have to have a license to haul, and, you know, in specific states. If you're driving on the highway and you see a truck driving by, oftentimes by the driver's side door, you'll see those stickers, the holographic stickers that have the state, you know, the state shape and a logo that says Washington, California, Oregon on it. That is a potential way to gatekeep on that. But you're right. I mean, I do think that there's something to the thought of, well, if you're going to make me buy these electric vehicles, you know, like these electric trucks, and present all these logistical nightmares and extra cost, I'm just going to incorporate in Idaho. I'm going to incorporate in another state, and then I'll still haul, you know, in your state back and forth. I'll get the license, but I'm certainly not going to have to overhaul my entire fleet if that is the case. And now this all comes from California, right, TJ? So what the trucking company said was, listen, Washington is not California, right? They've had a decades start on building up this infrastructure.
Right. And that's the interesting thing, is that the state is not just pursuing this policy of mandating that there be a certain percentage of electric vehicle sales. It's the exact specifics of the policy are not even being set by Washington State. They're being set by California based on California's own unique circumstances. So, you know, the interesting thing is the Trucking Association isn't asking them to end the program entirely. They're simply saying that it shouldn't be linked to California. It should be linked to what's logistically possible in Washington State, because the fear from the association is that this is going to create massive supply chain issues, because truckers just won't operate in certain areas, and it's going to be impossible to get goods and services to move around. And from an economic standpoint, this is kind of like cutting off the blood supply to a certain part of your body. The same way blood flows through the body, truckers flow goods and services for the most part throughout the state. And yeah, you do have trains, but those trains don't deliver your food to Safeway or your right. They have to be, most of the time, at some point, they are being moved by a truck.
Thank you, TJ. Appreciate it. Good story.
Thank you, Cole and TJ. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the Supreme Court's decision on a Title IX appeal, we'll go to Eliana Crudodle.
Requests by the federal government to stay injunctions over the Biden administration's controversial Title IX rule have been blocked by the U.S. Supreme Court. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what was the federal government asking for in this case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, in two cases that were in the Court of Appeals for the Fifth and Sixth Circuits, the Department of Justice, the federal government's attorneys, basically, they asked the Supreme Court to allow the government to implement Title IX, all the other parts of it that were not currently being litigated. So basically, the ask was, let us implement the parts of the Biden administration's Title IX rule, the expanded rule, that aren't being challenged by these states and where these injunctions are in place. So basically, the government said, you can't put any of this into practice because we're talking about it. Like, courts are able to say, hey, this is controversial. This is like a rulemaking thing from the government. You can't do this while we're talking about it in court because it could have potential harms for those that you're implementing this against. Like, there could be constitutional harms, and that those who are arguing that it could be harmful have merit. Like, there's merit to their argument. So we have to be able to, we are going to do this so that we don't have that, right? And so these are all based on legal doctrines and precedent and all that kind of thing. And again, it gets really complicated really quick. But essentially what the Department of Justice then was asking is, we're asking for them to give us the ability to implement the rule that is not related to these, like, basically three parts of that relate to gender identity, and that are controversial, right? So that are like about, locker rooms, things that you hear a lot about in boardrooms, and a lot of these kinds of like hot button issues that are culturally there. Cause a lot of it, they're arguing is like, this is fine. We can implement this. And I'm happy to talk about those too. But that's the basic overview of this. Is the government was like, we should be able to implement this. Don't you agree? And then the Supreme Court said in a 5-4 ruling, no, we don't agree. Like, you are not allowed to implement the policy, like the Title IX rule, in these states where there is an injunction.
So can you get into that of what is in the rule that's not controversial? Because I feel like a lot of people have heard about, and we've talked a lot about the controversial parts, which is the stuff concerning locker rooms, transgender athletes, things like that. But what else is in this rule that the Justice Department wanted to implement in the meantime?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that that Justice Sotomayor wrote about in her dissent was some of those issues. And she basically laid out, you have protections for students who are pregnant or who maybe have to breastfeed, and that there are protections in there against asking an employee about their marital status. So these are things that are not really controversial. These are kind of updates to the law. And I think that you can even say that they're in line with different other kinds of discrimination law or non-discrimination practice, like widespread. And I mean, we've seen a couple, like there's been laws in a number of different states that have governed like different protections for pregnant women and those kinds of things. And so these are not like bad things, and like they're really not controversial. Like, they're not being brought up by plaintiff states saying like, hey, we don't want these parts of it. Yeah, there's these different kinds of things that are not. And I'm trying to think. There's another one that prohibits staff and students from retaliating against students who file Title IX complaints, and provides a specific procedure and requires staff to know the law. And so those kinds of things are not being challenged. And like, I think that's something that the dissenting opinion says, we don't really, like, nobody has an issue with these. Like, there's not really any problem with having, retaliation protection. Like, you like, nobody wants somebody to get in trouble for saying like, hey, there's a potential issue at my school. Like, I think that's pretty non-controversial and not something that you really see in the news, that there's a lot more to this rulemaking than just the controversial stuff. But that's really gripped a lot of attention, right? A lot of headlines, a lot of stuff that we write about is about that, but there's a lot more to it. I mean, that's part of the expansion of the sex discrimination, is to include all of these other things as well. And so I think in some contexts, people might say, oh, that's too far and it's harmful. And then in these other contexts, they might not really have anything to say because they really they don't really have a beef with it. And so I think that is sort of the argument of the dissenting and also the government. So like the Department of Justice was arguing just that, like a lot of this rule is fine and we should implement it while we figure out the other stuff.
So then what was the reasoning that the Supreme Court gave for rejecting the request of the Justice Department?
Well, that's a great question. What they basically said is that it's too intertwined. And they basically said, everybody wants to talk about these things that are challenged and like there are these specific things. But the argument that the majority opinion had, the 5 justices who agreed with this, they basically said that things they're not readily severable from the remaining provisions, that you can't really take these things and chop it up into little pieces and say like, let's implement this and not implement this because they're sort of built into each other. So they say that the lower courts concluded the new definition of sex discrimination is intertwined with, in effect, many other provisions of the new rule. So basically how they built it, how they intended it is that if you expand gender identity, where you expand sex discrimination to include all these other things, then you're building the rule around that. And so I think that you kind of get into like the form of the rule versus the structure of the government, and sort of like these other bigger questions about like, when you have a rule, do you like follow the intent of like, this is how they built it? Or do you go into like the practice of like, should we be protecting these people?
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Crew. Joining me to dig into price controls is PhD economist, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, I just can't push past Democrat presidential candidate Kamala Harris's thoughts on price controls. I think, for the benefit of our audience, I think it's like we really need to explain what this means, because the way that it's being presented and carried by, some news media organizations is that price controls are an equal opposite reaction and an appropriate reaction to price gouging, which is an allegation that's been made, among larger companies and corporate greed. But let's talk specifically about price controls and what they are, what they serve to do. And, I think to be objective, let's talk about where they've been implemented and whether or not they work, because it's not like price controls haven't been utilized in other economies around the world.
Man, it's a disaster. You had to just go to Venezuela. In Venezuela, the outcome was the shelves were empty and people were starving. So that's the outcome, right? Shortages. Do you remember at the start of COVID, the right. COVID period where basically you had nothing on the shelves? Imagine having to live like that.
Oh yeah.
Right. And it wasn't just Venezuela, right? It's every country that has tried this stuff. Argentina is one of them. Strategic price controls is what they call them. Same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Shortages, mass shortages because of these limits on prices.
Well, why does it happen? Because I think to the average American, if you say to them, if it's presented in such a way that like this loaf of bread is going to be $2 and that's it. It's going to be a $2 loaf of bread from here on out. You're only going to pay $2 for this loaf of bread. That sounds great, but what actually happens? When a price is controlled?
Yeah, well, look, the economy is growing, right? And the demand for goods and services continues to increase. And if prices are not able to adjust, by the way, the cost of creating these goods and services also continues to increase. But if consumer prices are not able to adjust, then, businesses cannot continue to produce this stuff at a loss. Essential. They just can't.
So they stop
making it. That's one way. That's one mechanism. The other one is you just end up with less competition, fewer businesses entering the space because basically they can't make a profit. They can't turn a profit and they might actually lose money. And so, so it just doesn't work. In the case of housing, every time people have messed around with rent control, right? Rent controlled units. What's actually happened over time is renters were faced with fewer units to choose from. And the quality of rent-controlled units was actually worse, right? Like the decline, there's no way those landlords can continue to maintain these units. The upkeep goes down, the quality goes down, but also the quantity of units available to renters goes down. And so when you have fewer rental units, who's paying the price? I mean, it's those people that are looking for homes, right? To rent, right? And so you end up with these shortages. And it's just basic economics. I think everybody on the left and the right will agree, right? And I only say this because I feel like every conversation I have with folks now is just like, left ideology, right ideology, left ideology, right. And it's like, no, this is economics. These are just universal laws of economics. They don't care what political party you support, right? And so whether it's, well, by the way, price controls, we could talk about tariffs and subsidies and taxes in the same vein. It's all the same. These measures that distort markets end up costing us more in the long run. And so yeah, those are my thoughts on this. Tariffs on foreign or on goods. Well, what do you think they're going to do? Right. You enjoy this wonderful thing called the iPhone, a computer in my pocket. Right. And it's expensive, but it's kind of cheap enough given how much stuff I can do with it. Right. I can work from home. I could stay in bed. I can record this podcast on my iPhone. I mean, it's amazing, right?
Right.
Now, can you imagine if the price of everything that goes into the iPhone goes up and then the government says, Apple, you can no longer charge whatever you're charging and you cannot raise your prices either. Well, you know what Apple's going to do? They say, well, it's not worth it for us anymore. We can't do it. We can't pay our employees. We can't produce more iPhones. So like, what's the point? And so the quantity of iPhones goes down and then you end up with more people wanting an iPhone than there are iPhones available. And so it has the unintended consequence of resulting in mass shortages, everywhere. And then, by the way, in those countries, when you get rid of price controls, prices they skyrocket.
Right.
Prices skyrocket, because then you got the price adjustment that has to take place. But ultimately, over a longer period of time, right, you start to see more and more competition. You start to see more and more goods and services, right, coming back online. And that helps to bring back, that balance.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Kernodle. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.